"Your Majesty, are you feeling unwell?" The silver goblet slipped from King Edward Hawthorne's hand and shattered across the polished marble floor. The sound echoed through the grand hall, silencing hundreds of guests in an instant. For a long moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The king remained frozen at the head table, his pale blue eyes fixed on a young woman standing near the back of the crowd. She wore a simple cream-colored dress. Nothing about her appearance suggested wealth or status. A basket of fresh flowers rested in her hands, and traces of soil still clung to her sleeves from the morning's work. Yet the king stared at her as though he had seen a ghost. Charlotte Miller felt every eye in the room shift toward her. Heat rushed into her cheeks. She instinctively lowered her gaze, wishing she could disappear into the sea of nobles surrounding her. She had never belonged in places like this. The Royal Founding Festival was meant for kings, governors, merchants, and wealthy families from across the kingdom, not farmers from a small town nearly 100 miles away. Charlotte, her adoptive mother, whispered nervously beside her. "Don't look at him." Charlotte swallowed and nodded. That was easy enough. Looking at the king felt impossible anyway. The grandeur of the palace overwhelmed her. Crystal chandeliers glowed above like captured stars. Golden banners hung from towering columns. Everywhere she looked, people seemed elegant, confident, important. She felt like a patch of wild grass growing in the middle of a royal garden. At the front of the hall, Prince Alexander Hawthorne stepped toward his father. "Father," he asked quietly. The king blinked as though waking from a dream. The spell broke. Murmurs immediately spread through the crowd. Guests exchanged confused glances while servants hurried forward to clean the shattered glass. "I'm fine," the king said, though his voice sounded distant. His gaze drifted back toward Charlotte for only a second before he forced himself to look away. But that second was enough. Prince Alexander noticed. And unlike the others, he did not dismiss it. Charlotte shifted uneasily. Something about the king's expression lingered in her mind. It wasn't recognition exactly. It was deeper than that. Sadder. As though seeing her had reopened a door he had spent years trying to keep closed. Outside the palace windows, evening sunlight painted the city gold. Bells rang from distant towers as the celebration continued. Musicians played cheerful melodies. Noble families laughed and toasted to prosperity. Yet beneath the warmth of the festival, an invisible tension had begun to grow. Charlotte knew nothing about royal politics. She knew nothing about the kingdom's oldest secrets. She certainly knew nothing about the tragedy that had haunted the royal family for nearly 2 decades. To her, this was simply a once-in-a-lifetime trip beyond the boundaries of Willow Creek Farm. But across the hall, hidden behind a calm smile, King Edward could no longer ignore the impossible thought echoing through his mind. Because the young farm girl standing among strangers had the same eyes, the same smile, and the same unmistakable presence as the daughter he had lost 19 years ago. The palace lights remained bright long after sunset, but Charlotte Miller could not stop thinking about the way the king had looked at her. By the time she and her parents returned to the guest cottages beyond the palace gardens, the celebration still echoed across the capital. Music drifted through the cool evening air. Laughter carried from distant courtyards. Yet Charlotte felt strangely restless. She stepped outside and sat on a wooden bench overlooking the moonlit gardens. The scent of roses mixed with the familiar smell of earth that still lingered on her hands. It reminded her of home, Willow Creek, the farm, the small white house surrounded by endless fields, the place where her real life existed. She smiled softly as memories surfaced. Every morning before sunrise, Thomas Miller would already be awake, preparing for the day. Mary Miller would be baking bread in the kitchen while sunlight spilled across the windows. There had never been wealth. There had never been luxury. But there had always been love. Charlotte touched the silver necklace resting against her collarbone. She had worn it for as long as she could remember. According to her parents, it had been around her neck the night they found her. 19 years ago, during the worst storm Willow Creek had seen in decades. They had told her the story many times. A crying baby wrapped in blankets had appeared on their porch shortly after midnight. No note. No explanation. Only a silver necklace engraved with a symbol nobody recognized. Charlotte had often wondered who had left her there. Why they never returned. Why no one had ever searched for her. But eventually she stopped asking questions. The Millers were her family. Nothing else seemed to matter. A sudden voice interrupted her thoughts. That is a beautiful necklace. Charlotte looked up. An elderly woman stood nearby holding a lantern. She wore the dark blue uniform of a palace servant. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back beneath a lace cap. "Thank you," Charlotte said politely. "It belonged to whoever left me as a baby." The woman stepped closer. The lantern light reflected against the necklace. For a brief moment, her expression changed. Her eyes widened ever so slightly. Then she quickly looked away. "May I see it?" she asked softly. Charlotte hesitated before unclasping the chain and placing it into the woman's trembling hands. The servant studied the symbol carefully, a crown surrounded by 7 tiny stars. Her fingers tightened around the silver pendant. "Where did you get this?" she whispered. "My parents found it with me." The woman seemed unable to breathe. For several seconds, she simply stared at the necklace. Then footsteps approached along the garden path. Prince Alexander emerged from the shadows. The servant immediately straightened. "Your Highness." Alexander nodded politely, but noticed the concern in her face. "Is something wrong?" The elderly woman quickly returned the necklace to Charlotte. "No, Your Highness. Nothing at all." Yet her voice betrayed her. Charlotte sensed it immediately. Something had changed. Alexander sensed it too. As the servant hurried away into the darkness, he watched her leave with narrowed eyes. Then his gaze shifted toward Charlotte and the silver pendant resting in her palm. The same symbol. The same necklace. Another piece of a puzzle he did not yet understand. Neither of them noticed the figure standing behind a second-floor palace window. Lady Victoria Ashcroft observed the entire exchange from above. Her smile slowly disappeared, and for the first time in 19 years, fear entered her eyes. Lady Victoria Ashcroft did not sleep that night. Long after the palace had fallen quiet, she remained standing beside the window of her private chamber, staring at the distant guest cottages beyond the royal gardens. The silver necklace. She had seen it clearly. After 19 years, she had hoped never to see that symbol again. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the curtain as old memories threatened to surface. Memories she had spent nearly 2 decades burying beneath layers of carefully constructed lies. Meanwhile, unaware of the storm gathering around her, Charlotte slept peacefully. Dawn arrived with soft golden light spilling through the cottage windows. She woke to the familiar smell of fresh bread. For a brief moment, she forgot she was in the capital. Then reality returned. The palace. The festival. The king. The strange servant. Charlotte sat up slowly. Something felt different. Not around her, but beneath the surface. As if invisible threads had begun pulling her toward answers she had never sought. Later that morning, while Thomas and Mary explored the city marketplace, Charlotte wandered through the palace gardens alone. She followed a winding stone path lined with flowering hedges until she reached a quiet pond. The water reflected the clear blue sky like polished glass. It reminded her of another day, another story, the story of how her life had begun. 19 years earlier, a violent storm had swept across Willow Creek. Rain had fallen in sheets. Wind rattled windows and shook trees. Thomas Miller had been securing the barn doors when he heard a sound beneath the thunder. At first he thought it was his imagination. Then he heard it again. A baby crying. He rushed toward the front porch and froze. There, resting inside a woven basket, was an infant wrapped in expensive blankets. Not ordinary blankets. Even through the rain, Thomas could see fine embroidery stitched into the fabric. Whoever left the child behind had not been poor. Mary had carried the baby inside immediately. They searched for clues. A note. A name. Anything. But there was only the silver necklace around the infant's neck. And one more thing. A tiny embroidered crest sewn into the corner of the blanket. Neither of them recognized the symbol. By sunrise, they faced a choice. Turn the child over to distant authorities or raise her as their own. The decision had taken less than a minute. From that day forward, Charlotte became a Miller. The memory always brought warmth to her heart. She smiled as she sat beside the pond. Whatever mysteries surrounded her birth, one truth never changed. Thomas and Mary were her family. Suddenly, footsteps approached. Charlotte looked up and found Prince Alexander standing on the path. He was dressed simply today, without ceremonial robes or royal guards. For a moment, neither spoke. Then his eyes settled on the silver necklace resting against her collarbone. "Miss Miller," he said quietly, "there is something I would like to ask you about that necklace." Charlotte felt her pulse quicken, because deep inside, She already knew this conversation was about to change everything. "How long have you had it?" Prince Alexander asked. The morning breeze stirred the surface of the pond as Charlotte looked down at the silver necklace resting in her hands. "As long as I can remember," she replied. "My parents found it with me when I was a baby." Alexander nodded slowly. His expression remained calm, but his mind was racing. Every answer seemed to create two new questions. He sat on a nearby stone bench and studied the symbol again. The crown surrounded by 7 stars. It was not merely decorative. He knew that much. The design appeared in some of the oldest sections of the royal archives, hidden within records that few people ever examined. "Has anyone ever told you what it means?" he asked. Charlotte shook her head. "No. Most people assume it is just an old family heirloom." A faint smile touched Alexander's face. "I do not think there is anything ordinary about it." Charlotte felt a strange mixture of curiosity and nervousness. "You seem very interested in a necklace." "I am interested in anything that causes my father to drop a silver goblet in front of half the kingdom." That answer surprised a laugh out of her. For the first time since arriving in the capital, some of her tension faded. Alexander noticed. She did not laugh like court nobles. She did not calculate every word before speaking. There was an honesty about her that felt rare, genuine. As the conversation continued, he found himself asking about Willow Creek, about the farm, about her life growing up. Charlotte spoke about long summer days harvesting vegetables, helping neighbors repair fences, and delivering fresh bread to elderly residents during winter storms. Simple stories, ordinary stories. Yet Alexander listened carefully. Something about them felt important, because every tale revealed the same thing: kindness, responsibility, quiet strength. None of the qualities people usually associated with royalty. Yet somehow they seemed more royal than many nobles he had known his entire life. Across the palace grounds, hidden behind a second-floor balcony, Lady Victoria watched the meeting unfold. Her stomach tightened with every passing minute. This was becoming dangerous, far more dangerous than she had expected. The servant who recognized the necklace. The king's reaction. Now the prince's growing interest. Too many pieces were moving at once. She turned sharply and walked away from the balcony. There was only one place left to search. If the necklace had appeared, perhaps other evidence had survived as well. Deep within the palace library, forgotten records filled shelves that stretched from floor to ceiling. Most had not been touched in years. Victoria intended to make certain they stayed that way. Back beside the pond, Charlotte rose to leave. Her parents would be wondering where she had gone. "Thank you for speaking with me," Alexander said. "I suspect this will not be our last conversation." Charlotte smiled politely. "I suspect you are right." As she walked away along the garden path, neither of them noticed the elderly servant from the night before standing beneath a distant archway. Tears glistened in her eyes as she watched Charlotte disappear among the flowers, because she had finally remembered where she had seen that necklace before. 19 years earlier, around the neck of a missing princess. The old palace clock struck midnight as Prince Alexander pushed open the doors of the royal archives. Dust floated through beams of candlelight. Rows of ancient books stretched into darkness. Most people avoided this place. To Alexander, it felt like stepping into the kingdom's memory. He carried a single question with him. Who was Charlotte Miller? Across the palace, King Edward sat alone in his private study. A portrait rested on the desk before him. The painting showed Queen Eleanor holding a small child in her arms. A little girl with bright eyes and a gentle smile. 19 years had passed since that portrait had been painted. 19 years since the kingdom lost its princess. The king stared at the image for a long time before quietly closing his eyes. He had spent years teaching himself not to hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope could break a heart more completely than grief. Yet every time he thought of the young woman from Willow Creek, that fragile hope returned. Meanwhile, deep within another wing of the palace, Lady Victoria moved through a restricted section of the library. She carried a lantern and a ring of keys. Her footsteps echoed softly against the stone floor. She knew exactly what she was looking for. Old records, birth registries, witness accounts, anything connected to the disappearance of the princess. If evidence still existed, she needed to find it first. Several shelves away, Alexander was conducting his own search. Hours passed as he examined faded journals and official reports. Most revealed nothing useful. Then he found a document dated 19 years earlier. His pulse quickened as he unfolded the fragile pages. The report described the night the princess disappeared during a violent storm. Most details were familiar, but one line caught his attention immediately. The infant princess had been wearing a ceremonial necklace commissioned exclusively for members of the royal family. A silver pendant featuring a crown surrounded by 7 stars. Alexander slowly lowered the page. The symbol matched Charlotte's necklace perfectly. At the same moment, another discovery was unfolding elsewhere in the palace. The elderly servant, whose name was Margaret Whitmore, sat alone inside her small room beneath the servant quarters. In her hands rested an old wooden box she had not opened in years. Inside were keepsakes from her decades of service to the royal family. Letters, drawings, small mementos. Near the bottom lay a folded piece of cloth. Margaret carefully unfolded it. Tears immediately filled her eyes. Embroidered into one corner was the same crest she remembered seeing on Charlotte's childhood blanket. The evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Yet none of them knew how closely their investigations were beginning to converge, because Lady Victoria had just discovered something even more dangerous. Hidden inside a forgotten ledger was the name of a farmer from Willow Creek, Thomas Miller. Her face turned pale as she read the entry. For 19 years, she had believed every trace had vanished. Now she realized she had been wrong. And for the first time since Charlotte arrived in the capital, Victoria understood that the truth was no longer sleeping in the past. It was waking up. The next morning began with rain. Soft drops tapped against palace windows while gray clouds drifted above the capital. Charlotte stood inside the guest cottage, helping Mary prepare for their journey home. The festival was ending. By sunset, they would be back in Willow Creek. She should have been relieved. Instead, an uneasy feeling lingered in her chest. Too many strange things had happened in too few days. The king's reaction, the servants' questions, Prince Alexander's growing interest in her necklace. Nothing made sense anymore. Across the palace, Margaret Whitmore hurried through a quiet corridor with unusual determination. Clutched tightly beneath her arm was the folded piece of embroidered cloth she had found the night before. Her heart pounded as she approached the king's private study. After decades of loyal service, she had never entered those doors uninvited. Today could not wait. A royal guard announced her arrival. Moments later, Margaret stepped inside. King Edward looked up from his desk. The moment he saw her expression, concern crossed his face. "Margaret," he asked, "what is it?" The elderly servant carefully placed the cloth on the desk. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "I believe I have remembered something." The king unfolded the fabric. His breath caught immediately. The royal crest. Faded with age, but unmistakable. He knew it well. "Where did you find this?" he asked. Margaret explained everything. The necklace. Charlotte. The memory that had returned to her. 19 years earlier, she had helped prepare the princess's belongings before a royal journey. She remembered the blanket. She remembered the embroidery. Most of all, she remembered the necklace that accompanied it. By the time she finished speaking, silence filled the room. The king lowered his eyes to the cloth again. His hands trembled slightly. Hope. Dangerous hope. Yet for the first time in years, evidence existed. Real evidence. Not rumors. Not wishes. Meanwhile, Prince Alexander sat in the archives examining additional records. His search had become an obsession. Every document seemed to point toward the same impossible conclusion. Then he discovered something unexpected. A witness statement from 19 years ago mentioned a traveling carriage seen leaving the capital during the storm. The report included a name. Lady Victoria Ashcroft. Alexander stared at the page. His pulse quickened. Victoria had always claimed she spent that week at her family estate far from the city. Why would her name appear in a report connected to the princess's disappearance? At nearly the same moment, Victoria received news that chilled her completely. A palace servant informed her that Margaret Whitmore had spent over an hour meeting privately with the king. Victoria immediately understood what that meant. The old woman remembered. The truth was moving faster than she anticipated. For the first time, control was slipping away. Back at the guest cottage, Charlotte stepped outside to enjoy the fresh scent of rain before departure. She looked toward the distant palace towers one final time. She still believed she would return home by evening. She still believed her life would soon return to normal. But high above the palace grounds, King Edward stood at his study window holding the embroidered cloth in one hand and staring toward the cottage where Charlotte waited. And deep in his heart, He was beginning to believe that the daughter he lost 19 years ago had finally come home. Charlotte was halfway to the front gate with Thomas and Mary when royal guards approached the guest cottage. The sight of them immediately drew attention from nearby visitors preparing to leave the capital. Charlotte's stomach tightened. Had something happened? The lead guard bowed respectfully. "Miss Charlotte Miller, His Majesty requests your presence in the Grand Hall." Thomas exchanged a worried glance with Mary. "Is there a problem?" he asked. "I have not been informed, sir," the guard replied. "Only that the request is immediate." Within an hour, Charlotte found herself walking through the palace once again. But this time the atmosphere felt completely different. The hallways seemed quieter. The servants seemed tense. Even the guards appeared unusually alert. When the massive doors of the Grand Hall opened, Charlotte froze. Hundreds of people filled the room. Nobles, ministers, advisors, and royal officials occupied nearly every seat. At the far end stood King Edward and Prince Alexander. Lady Victoria Ashcroft stood nearby, her expression perfectly composed. Charlotte suddenly felt very small, very exposed. She looked toward the king. "Your Majesty?" Before he could answer, Victoria stepped forward. "Before this gathering proceeds," she announced, her voice carrying easily through the chamber, "there is a matter that must be addressed." A ripple of curiosity spread through the crowd. Charlotte felt every eye turn toward her. Victoria continued. "Rumors have begun spreading throughout the palace. Dangerous rumors. Claims that this young woman possesses some connection to the royal family." Murmurs immediately filled the room. Charlotte's heart began to race. What was happening? "I believe such claims should be examined publicly," Victoria said, "for the protection of the crown and the integrity of this kingdom." Prince Alexander narrowed his eyes. He did not miss the satisfaction hidden beneath Victoria's calm tone. She was controlling the conversation before anyone else could. "No one has accused Miss Miller of wrongdoing," Alexander said firmly. "Not yet," Victoria replied. "But false claims have destroyed kingdoms before. Surely truth has nothing to fear." Charlotte stood motionless. She wanted to speak, but she did not even understand the accusation. "I never claimed to be anything other than a farmer's daughter," she said quietly. A few nobles exchanged skeptical looks. Others whispered behind raised hands. Some seemed sympathetic. Others clearly did not. Victoria slowly approached Charlotte. "Then perhaps you can explain the royal necklace." The room immediately fell silent. Charlotte instinctively touched the pendant at her neck. "It belonged to whoever left me as a child," she answered. "That is all I know." "Convenient," one noble muttered. More whispers followed. Charlotte felt heat rising into her face. She had done nothing wrong. Yet somehow she felt as though she were being judged for a crime she did not understand. Thomas suddenly stepped forward from the back of the hall. "My wife and I raised that girl," he said. "She is honest. She would never deceive anyone." His voice shook slightly, but his determination did not. Mary moved beside him and took Charlotte's hand. The simple gesture nearly brought tears to Charlotte's eyes. Then a new voice broke through the tension. "Enough." King Edward rose from his throne. Instantly the room became silent. The king's gaze swept across the gathering before settling on Charlotte. There was sadness in his eyes. "Hope too. This matter will be decided by evidence," he said. "And tomorrow, evidence will be presented." A wave of anticipation swept through the chamber. Charlotte's pulse thundered in her ears, because she suddenly realized that by this time tomorrow, her entire life might be different. The following afternoon, the Grand Hall was more crowded than it had been during the festival itself. Every seat was occupied. Nobles filled the balconies. Advisors lined the walls. Word had spread throughout the capital that the mystery surrounding Charlotte Miller would finally be resolved. Charlotte stood beside Thomas and Mary near the center of the chamber. Her hands trembled slightly, though she tried not to show it. She had barely slept. Too many questions circled through her mind. Questions she was no longer sure she wanted answered. Across the hall, Prince Alexander stepped forward carrying several aged documents from the royal archives. The room gradually fell silent. King Edward rose from his throne. "Today," he announced, "we seek truth. Nothing more. Nothing less." Alexander began presenting the evidence. First came the records describing the ceremonial necklace commissioned exclusively for the royal family nearly 2 decades earlier. The silver pendant bearing a crown surrounded by 7 stars. Charlotte removed the necklace and handed it to the king. Murmurs swept through the audience as officials confirmed the match. Then Margaret Whitmore was called forward. The elderly servant spoke clearly despite her age. She described preparing the princess's belongings 19 years ago. She described the necklace, the blanket, the embroidered crest. When she finished, another servant presented the cloth Margaret had preserved all those years. The crest matched the one recorded in royal archives. The room grew quieter with each revelation. Then Alexander presented the witness report he had discovered, a document connecting Lady Victoria Ashcroft to events surrounding the princess's disappearance. For the first time, uncertainty appeared on Victoria's face. "This proves nothing," she said quickly. "It proves only that I traveled during that week." "Then perhaps this will help," Alexander replied. He produced a second document, a forgotten ledger listing payments, routes, and names connected to travel arrangements made during the storm. Victoria's expression paled. Several advisors exchanged shocked glances as they examined the records. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together. Charlotte felt as though the room was spinning around her. None of this felt real. Then King Edward slowly descended from the throne platform. The entire hall watched as he approached her. His eyes glistened with emotion he could no longer hide. "Charlotte," he said softly, "there is one final thing." Margaret stepped forward once more. "Your Majesty," she whispered. The princess was born with a small birthmark behind her left shoulder, a mark shaped like a star. Charlotte froze. Thomas and Mary looked at one another. They both knew it was true. They had seen it countless times throughout her childhood. The king closed his eyes briefly. Hope, grief, and love seemed to pass across his face all at once. When he opened them again, his voice trembled. "Then there can be no doubt." Silence filled the hall. Hundreds of people waited. Charlotte's heart pounded. "Charlotte Miller," King Edward said, "you are not a farmer's daughter by birth. You are Princess Charlotte Hawthorne, the daughter this kingdom has searched for during the last 19 years. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then one by one, nobles began rising from their seats. Advisors followed. Guards followed. Soon the entire hall stood in respect. Charlotte stared at the sea of faces surrounding her. The farm girl from Willow Creek had entered the palace as a stranger. Now an entire kingdom was bowing before her. For several long seconds, Charlotte could not move. The faces before her blurred as tears filled her eyes. "Princess." The word echoed through her mind, strange and unfamiliar. She looked at King Edward, searching his face for answers. Instead, she found something deeper. Love. The kind of love that had survived 19 years of loss without fading. The king stepped closer. "I know this is overwhelming," he said softly, "and I do not expect you to understand it all today." Charlotte swallowed hard. "I do not know what to say." "Then do not say anything yet," he replied. "You have already been through enough." The crowd remained standing as Charlotte turned toward Thomas and Mary. Both looked as stunned as she felt. For a moment, she feared everything had changed. Then Mary opened her arms. Charlotte rushed forward and embraced her. The hall disappeared. The nobles disappeared. The throne disappeared. There was only the woman who had tucked her into bed during storms, comforted her through sickness, and loved her every day of her life. Thomas joined the embrace, his eyes shining with emotion. "You will always be our daughter," he whispered. Charlotte held them tighter. "And you will always be my parents." A hush settled over the chamber. Many of the nobles lowered their eyes. Even those who spent their lives surrounded by titles and privilege recognized the truth of that moment. Love had raised her. Not royalty, not wealth. Love. King Edward watched quietly before stepping forward once more. "There is something the kingdom should know," he said. Everyone turned toward him. The king faced Thomas and Mary. Then, to the astonishment of the entire court, he bowed his head. "For 19 years, you protected and cared for my daughter when I could not. No reward could ever repay that debt." Gasps swept through the hall. No one could remember the last time a king had publicly honored two farmers in such a way. Thomas looked completely speechless. Mary wiped away tears. Prince Alexander smiled. It felt right. More right than anything else that had happened during the past few days. Several weeks later, preparations began for Charlotte's formal introduction as princess. Tailors arrived. Advisors offered lessons. Courtiers filled her schedule with endless meetings. Yet despite everything, Charlotte remained herself. She still preferred early mornings. She still loved walking through gardens with dirt on her hands. She still treated servants with the same kindness she showed everyone else. One afternoon, she stood on a palace balcony overlooking thousands of citizens gathered below. Beside her stood King Edward and Prince Alexander. Behind her stood nobles and officials from across the kingdom. Yet Charlotte's eyes searched only for two familiar faces. She found them immediately. Thomas and Mary stood near the front of the crowd. When they smiled at her, the nervousness in her chest disappeared. The announcer called her name. Cheers rose from the city square. Charlotte stepped forward into the sunlight. The journey that began on a farm had brought her here. But she finally understood something important. A crown could reveal who she was by birth. It could never define who she had become. As the bells of the capital rang across the kingdom, Princess Charlotte Hawthorne smiled down at the people before her. And among them stood the family who had taught her the lesson that mattered most of all. True nobility is not found in titles. It is found in the hearts that choose to love.